My
Someone
name
who
is
had
Ref
already
Onal,
begun
and I
working
am
on
what
what
my
came
people call a
next.
witness.
My name
That is
is
the
Vael
polite
Sovereignty.
translation.
I am a
A more
witness,
honest one
and
would
for
be
the first
something
time in
closer to the
412
unfortunate
years,
observer,
I
the
have
one who
documented
stands at the
something
edge
I
of
was not
history,
certain I would ever
watching
see.
events
The
unfold just
largest power
slowly
in the
enough to
galaxy,
understand them and just
looking up,
quickly enough to
and
never stop
realizing
them.
the ceiling
I
was
have
higher than
recorded
it
17
believed.
wars, 9 extinctions, and the quiet collapse of 3 empires that believed themselves permanent. I have watched stars dim under the weight of poor decisions and civilizations vanish because someone, somewhere, thought they had more time than they did. In 412 years of doing this, I have learned a simple rule. The galaxy does not favor the strongest. It does not reward the oldest. It certainly does not care about who believes they are in control. It favors the ones who understand what is actually happening before anyone else does. And for most of my life, that was us. The Vael Sovereignty had been the dominant force in this galaxy for longer than most species had possessed language. We cataloged, we managed, we guided. We did not rush into mistakes. We anticipated them, contained them, and when necessary, erased them before they had time to become inconvenient. Which is why, when the survey report arrived describing a small, wet planet in an unremarkable system, no one in the chamber expected anything unusual. I remember the moment clearly. I was standing at the back of the council hall, recording as always, while the High Chancellor reviewed the findings. Oxygen-rich atmosphere. Liquid water. Multicellular life. A developing species with primitive technology and early attempts at spaceflight. The kind of report we processed thousands of times without incident. And then there was the final note. The species was preparing to leave its home system. There was a pause in the room. Not concern, not even interest. Just the mild acknowledgement one gives to a trivial detail. I wrote it down because that is what I do. I write down the details others overlook. The Chancellor smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was something far more dangerous. It was a comfortable one. The smile of someone who has already decided how something will end before it has even begun. Establish contact, she said. Welcome them. I recorded the order. I recorded the tone. I even recorded the exact angle of that smile, though I did not yet understand why it mattered. I understand now. Because that was the moment we made our first mistake. The system was catalogued under a designation that translated loosely to Low Priority Expansion Zone. It sat in a quiet region of the galaxy, far from contested borders, far from anything that required attention. The kind of place where young civilizations were allowed to grow just enough to become useful. We had done this before. Many times. The process was refined, efficient, almost routine. We would initiate first contact, present the structure of the Galactic Compact, and extend an invitation. New species would join, grateful for protection, eager for advancement. They would integrate, contribute, and over time become part of a system that functioned exactly as designed. There had never been a failure. Not a single one. So when the diplomatic team was assembled, there was no urgency. No contingency planning. No debate about potential risks. Ambassador Soren Delvik was assigned to lead the contact, which in itself was a signal of how seriously the situation was being taken. Soren specialized in smooth transitions, making new species feel welcomed while ensuring they never felt equal. He was very good at it. The recordings from that first meeting are still stored in the archive. I have reviewed them many times, each viewing revealing something I missed before. At the time, however, nothing stood out as unusual. The humans received the delegation in a chamber they called the United Nations General Assembly. A single room representing a single planet attempting to speak with one voice. It was, from our perspective, inefficient, fragmented, temporary. Soren delivered the standard address. A carefully constructed speech refined over centuries. It acknowledged their achievements, framed them as promising, and positioned the compact as the natural next step in their development. It offered technology, protection, and inclusion. Every species before them had reacted the same way. Gratitude. The humans listened. That was the first difference. They did not interrupt. They did not display fear or excitement. They simply listened, quietly, attentively, as if they were not being introduced to a galaxy-spanning power, but instead attending a lecture they intended to review later. When Soren finished, he waited for the expected response. It did not come. Instead, one of the human representatives leaned forward and asked a question. Not about the technology. Not about the benefits. About the terms. Specifically, about the clauses governing trade distribution, jurisdictional authority, and withdrawal conditions. It was a small shift, almost imperceptible. The kind of thing that would not trigger concern in anyone who was not actively looking for it. I wrote it down anyway. The questions continued. Precise. Methodical. Each one peeling back a layer of the agreement, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a kind of quiet persistence that suggested they were not searching for reassurance. They were searching for structure. Soren answered as he always did. Smoothly. Confidently. Every response carefully framed to emphasize cooperation and mutual benefit. It was a performance he had perfected. And yet, as I watched the recording later, I noticed something I had missed in the moment. The humans were not reacting to his answers. They were cataloging them. When the questions ended, the room fell silent. Soren prepared to conclude the meeting, to move toward the expected acceptance. Instead, the human representative spoke again. Her name was Zara Hen. At the time, it was just another name to record. It did not stand out. It does now. We appreciate the offer, she said. We will review the documentation and respond within 30 days. 30 days. I remember writing that number down and pausing for just a fraction of a second longer than usual. It was not alarming. It was not even unusual enough to comment on formally. But it was different. Every other species we had encountered had agreed within hours. Some within minutes. The compact was not something one delayed. Soren smiled and accepted their timeline without question. He should have asked why. I wrote a note in my log. Humans are reading carefully. It was a simple observation. Not a warning. Not yet. Just a detail. And like most details recorded by witnesses, it was not acted upon. That, as it turned out, was our second mistake. The humans returned in 29 days. Not 30. That detail mattered more than anyone realized at the time. It suggested precision, not hesitation. They had not needed extra time. They had taken exactly as much as they intended to take, and not a moment more. The chamber was prepared in the same way as before. The same delegates, the same structure, the same expectation that this would be a formality. Soren stood at the center, composed as always, ready to conclude what had, until now, been a predictable process. I was watching from the observation tier, recording everything. The human delegation was different. Zara Ohen stood at the front again, but she was no longer alone in presence. Behind her were individuals who had not attended the first meeting. That in itself was not unusual. Species often expanded their representation once they understood the scope of what was being offered. What was unusual was the type of individuals they had brought. There was a man who did nothing but take notes. Not casually, not intermittently, but continuously, as if every word spoken in that chamber was being preserved with deliberate intent. There was another who did not take notes at all, who simply watched Soren with an intensity that was difficult to categorize. Not hostility. Not curiosity. Assessment. And there was one who said nothing. He sat slightly apart from the others, hands folded, expression neutral. If I had not been paying attention, I might not have noticed him at all. I noticed him. Zara began with a statement of appreciation. It was formal, measured, exactly what one would expect from a species preparing to accept integration into the compact. Soren relaxed. I saw it happen. A subtle shift in posture, a fraction of tension leaving his shoulders. He believed, as we all did, that this was the conclusion. Then she continued. We are prepared to join the Galactic Compact, she said, with several amendments to the proposed agreement. Soren's expression did not change. That was a testament to his training. But I had been observing long enough to recognize the smallest deviations, and there was one. A single blink, slightly slower than normal. The documents were transferred. I did not see them immediately. Those of us in observation rarely did. But I saw the reaction as Soren reviewed the first section, then the second, then the third. His stillness changed. It was no longer the stillness of control. It was the stillness of recalibration. The amendments were not aggressive. They were not framed as demands or ultimatums. They were, in tone, entirely cooperative. That was what made them extraordinary. They were precise. Each clause referenced specific sections of the original agreement, cross-linked with documented precedents from other compact members. Instances where similar language had been interpreted in ways that favored the sovereignty. Cases where ambiguities had resulted in the gradual erosion of member autonomy. The humans had not just read the treaty. They had studied its history. They identified contradictions, subtle ones, buried deep within the legal structure, that consistently resolved in our favor. They proposed revisions that removed those contradictions entirely. They analyzed the economic framework and demonstrated, with mathematical clarity, how resource distribution over multiple generations would shift disproportionately towards sovereignty-controlled networks. They rewrote it, not to reject it, to correct it. I remember the exact moment I realized what I was looking at. It was not defiance. It was understanding. Complete, detailed, and deeply uncomfortable understanding. Soren maintained his composure. He acknowledged the amendments, praised their thoroughness, and stated that they would require review by the Chancellor and the Council. It was the correct response. It was also, though none of us said it aloud, an admission that this was no longer a standard integration. The meeting ended without resolution. That had never happened before. Back on Vael Prime, the Council convened. I was present, as always, recording what would later become the official account. The discussion lasted 3 days. 3 days of analysis, debate, and something I had not seen in that chamber in a very long time. Discomfort. The amendments were discussed in detail. Each one examined not for its wording, but for its implications. What would happen if we accepted them? What precedent they would set? How existing member species might respond if they realized similar revisions were possible? The conclusion, when it came, was unanimous. The amendments were unacceptable. Not because they were unreasonable, because they were too effective. Accepting them would weaken the structural control the sovereignty maintained over the compact. It would shift the balance, not immediately, but inevitably. And yet, rejecting the humans outright was also not an option. They were developing quickly, faster than projected. Their technological trajectory suggested that within a relatively short span of time, by our standards, they would become significant regardless of our involvement. The decision that emerged was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. We would proceed as we always had. A counterproposal would be issued. Minor concessions would be made, cosmetic adjustments to language that would appear meaningful without altering the underlying structure. The integration process would begin, and over time, the humans would adapt to it as every other species had. It was a strategy with a perfect record. 18 successful integrations. No failures. Soren was tasked with delivering the revised terms. He did so flawlessly. The language was careful, the tone respectful, the presentation precise. The benefits were emphasized. The concessions were framed as significant. To anyone who had not already understood the system, it would have been convincing. The humans listened again. The same way they had before. Quietly. Completely. Without interruption. And then, from the back of the room, the silent man spoke. It was the first time I had heard his voice. It was calm. "Ambassador," he said, "in the technology sharing program, you have outlined 6 areas of cooperation. May I ask why certain fields are excluded?" Soren answered without hesitation. Those fields, he explained, were restricted under standard compact security protocols. They would become available after a review period. "How long is that period?" the man asked. There was a pause. Not long. Not obvious. But it was there. 200 years, Soren said. The room went still. Not dramatically. Not visibly to most. But something shifted. The man nodded once, as if confirming a calculation. "Thank you," he said and leaned back. No argument. No objection. Just acknowledgement. I wrote another note in my log. The quiet ones are the most important. The humans requested time to consider the counterproposal. 14 days this time. They returned with their answer. They accepted. I remember the feeling that followed. It was brief, difficult to define. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Something else. Something closer to the sense that a pattern had just completed itself, but you were not yet sure what the pattern meant. Zara Ohen signed the treaty. She smiled when she did it. I recorded that too. At the time, it seemed like a minor detail. It was not. It was, in fact, the moment everything that followed became inevitable. I wrote one final note for that day. They know something we don't. No one read it. The integration period began exactly as designed. On the surface, everything proceeded with flawless precision. Human representatives attended compact summits. Their ships appeared in joint fleet operations. Their industries aligned with established trade networks. They contributed resources on schedule, fulfilled obligations without resistance, and displayed a level of cooperation that, by every measurable standard, marked them as an ideal new member. If there had been a model for successful integration, humanity would have matched it perfectly. That was the problem. Perfection, in my experience, is rarely natural. It is constructed. At first, there was nothing that could be formally categorized as unusual. Reports came in from various departments, economic, military, diplomatic, and all of them described the same thing. Efficiency, compliance, progress. The humans were doing everything we expected them to do. And nothing we didn't. I continued my work as I always had, reviewing logs, cross-referencing data, documenting patterns. It was not a role that drew attention. Witnesses are not decision-makers. We observe. We record. We notice things that do not fit neatly into reports. Small things, like the frequency with which certain human delegates appeared at high-level meetings. Not enough to be questioned. Just enough to be consistent. Like the way their questions, even years after integration, never lost their precision. They did not ask more questions than necessary. They asked exactly the right ones. Like the absence of mistakes. Every species makes them during integration. Miscommunications, procedural errors, misinterpretations of compact protocols. It is expected. It is, in many ways, part of the process. The humans made none. Not a single documented incident of misalignment in their first decade as members. I wrote that down. I also wrote down something else. They are learning faster than they are adapting. It was a subtle distinction, but an important one. Adapting implies following a system. Learning implies understanding it. The difference between the two is often the difference between participation and control. Years passed. Then decades. From the perspective of the sovereignty, nothing changed. The compact remained stable. Expansion continued. Member species functioned within established parameters. The system worked because it had always worked. But from the perspective of someone watching closely, something else was happening. The humans were everywhere. Not in a way that drew attention. Not in a way that violated any agreements. They were simply present. At trade conferences, at infrastructure planning sessions, at joint research initiatives. Always participating. Always contributing. Always observing. Finn Adler, the note-taker from the second meeting, became one of the most recognized human diplomats in the compact. He traveled constantly, attending events across multiple systems, building relationships, gathering familiarity with processes that most species never needed to fully understand. He was liked. That mattered more than most realized. People speak more freely around those they like. Cole Vash, the observer who never took notes, spent years embedded within compact fleet operations. Officially, he was there as a liaison, a representative ensuring coordination between human forces and sovereignty command. Unofficially, he was learning how we moved. Fleet positioning, response timing, communication structures. Not through classified access, nothing so obvious. Through presence, through attention. He watched. And the quiet man, the one who had asked about the 200-year restriction, disappeared. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. He simply stopped appearing in records. His name ceased to show up in attendance logs, in diplomatic communications, in any of the places where individuals are normally tracked. I searched for it once. Just once. There was nothing. No record of departure. No reassignment. No explanation. Just absence. I wrote a note. Somewhere, something important is happening. It was not a conclusion. It was an intuition. And like most intuitions recorded by witnesses, it went nowhere. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a major event. It came from a minor report. A patrol cruiser operating in a peripheral sector logged an encounter with an unidentified vessel. The description was brief. The ship did not match any known compact design. Its movement was unusual. Not impossible, but inconsistent with established propulsion methods. The cruiser attempted to establish contact. No response. It moved to intercept. The vessel maneuvered in a way the commander later described as geometrically inconsistent, and then it was gone. No trace. No signature. The report was filed. It was categorized as a possible sensor anomaly. It was assigned low priority. It would have remained there if I had not been reviewing border logs that week. I remember the moment I read it. That same sensation I had felt before, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore once noticed. The feeling that something just beyond visibility had shifted. I flagged the report. Then I did something I do not often do. I began pulling related data. Not because there was a clear connection. There wasn't. Not yet. But because the pattern felt incomplete. The responses came in over the next several days. Individually, each one was unremarkable. Together, they were not. Human shipyards in multiple systems had increased output. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger concern. But enough to exceed what was required for their assigned compact contributions. Facilities registered as civilian were operating at energy levels more consistent with military-grade production. Academic institutions had produced a disproportionate number of specialists in fields that, according to treaty limitations, they should not have been focusing on. Advanced propulsion, weapons physics, strategic material science. Nothing illegal. Nothing explicitly in violation of compact rules. Just misaligned. And then there were the acquisitions. Small, scattered, almost invisible within the vast flow of data that moved through compact systems every day. Requests for access to archival records. Copies of infrastructure schematics. Fragments of security protocols. Individually insignificant. Collectively comprehensive. I compiled everything. I reviewed it twice. Then a third time. The conclusion, when it formed, was not precise. It was not even fully rational. But it was unavoidable. They are preparing for something. I brought the data to Admiral Thesk Vorin, head of Compact Security. He listened without interruption. Reviewed each piece. Asked a series of questions, direct, focused, exactly the kind that cut through uncertainty. Then he sat in silence for a long time. How long? He asked finally. Since the treaty, I said. He considered that. Then he asked the only question that mattered. For what? I did not have an answer. Something large, I said. Something they have had decades to build. He authorized a quiet review. No alerts. No disruptions. Nothing that would signal awareness. It was a cautious decision. A measured one. It came 34 years too late. 5 days after the review was authorized, the situation changed. Not gradually. Completely. A courier vessel transiting a major shipping corridor went silent. Not destroyed. Not damaged. Silent. All 6 of its transponders ceased transmission simultaneously. No distress signal. No anomaly report. Just absence. 40 minutes later, it reappeared. Systems functional. Crew unharmed. They reported nothing unusual. No interruption. No awareness of any gap. But the logs told a different story. 40 minutes of data were missing. Not corrupted. Not erased in a detectable way. Removed. Precisely. Something had accessed the vessel, taken what it needed, and left without leaving evidence of its presence. I read the report in silence. And for the first time in over 4 centuries of witnessing, I felt something I had not expected to feel again. Not uncertainty. Not concern. Fear. Not because of what had been done, but because of what it implied. If something could do this once, it could do it anywhere. And if it had been happening before, we would not have known. The pattern was no longer incomplete. It was visible. Clear. Unavoidable. The humans had not just been learning the system. They had been inside it. For years. Quietly. Patiently. Waiting. I pulled up the original treaty. I looked at the signature at the bottom. Zaro Hen. Smiling. And for the first time, I understood what that smile had meant. It had never been acceptance. It had been timing. The message arrived at 3:40 Vael Standard Time. It did not trigger an alarm. That detail, more than anything else, was what unsettled the room when we later reviewed the logs. The Chancellor's personal channel was protected by layers of encryption that had never been breached, not in 6,000 years of recorded history, not by any external force, not even during active conflict scenarios. And yet the signal passed through as if it belonged there. No alerts. No resistance. It simply appeared. I was in the outer chamber when the summons came. By the time I entered the situation room, the message had already been received, isolated, and examined for immediate threats. The Chancellor stood at the center of the room, reading it in silence while her security detail argued in low, urgent tones about protocol. She read it once. Then again. Then a third time. There were only 17 words. We have been patient. We have been thorough. We would like to renegotiate. Please review the attached. No threats. No demands. No urgency. Just a statement of fact, followed by a request. That, in its own way, was more alarming than any declaration of hostility could have been. There was an attachment. Standard procedure required a full security sweep before any external data was opened, especially under circumstances that already defied explanation. 6 hours, minimum. Multiple redundancies. Controlled isolation. The head of security began outlining the process. The Chancellor did not look up from the message. Open it, she said. There was hesitation. Chancellor, we cannot guarantee. Open it. The tone was not raised. It did not need to be. The package was accessed. I have spent my entire career documenting events that others struggle to describe. I have developed, over time, a certain resistance to shock. Patterns repeat. Outcomes echo. Even the most extreme scenarios tend to follow recognizable structures. What I saw in that data package did not follow any structure I recognized. It contained 3 sections. The first was a map. Not a public one. Not the version distributed to Compact members as part of standard transparency agreements. This was the actual map, the one restricted to the highest levels of Sovereignty Command. Every fleet position. Every resupply node. Every command relay. Every weapons cache. All of it. Accurate. Completely. 7 installations that officially did not exist. Facilities whose locations were known only to the Chancellor, Admiral Thesk, and a handful of others, were marked with exact precision. No approximations. No errors. I heard someone in the room exhale sharply, though I could not say who. The second section was an analysis. It outlined a scenario. 12 critical points within our logistics network, identified as optimal targets for disruption. Not destruction, disruption. The distinction was important. The document detailed how our fleets would respond. Not generally. Not theoretically. Specifically. Which commands would be issued first. Which routes would be prioritized. Which contingencies would be activated. It predicted decision sequences. Step by step. And then for each step it provided a counter. Not speculative. Prepared. I watched Admiral Thesk read it. He did not move for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was not to question the validity of the analysis. It was to confirm it. Quietly. As if speaking too loudly might make it more real. The third section was a document. A treaty. Not a revision of the original. Not an amendment. A replacement. It was structured as a negotiation, formatted with the same language conventions as compact agreements, but the content made something very clear. This was not a proposal from a weaker party. This was a framework offered from a position of control. It outlined terms of full sovereign equality between humanity and the sovereignty, equal representation, removal of technological restrictions, independent arbitration structures, and one clause that changed everything. Any member species could request a review of their agreement at any time, with binding outcomes not subject to sovereignty override. I did not need to calculate the implications. They were immediate. The compact, as it existed, would not survive those terms. Not in its current form. The Chancellor read the document in full. Then she placed it down on the table and asked a single question. What did they build? No one answered. Because the truth was, we did not know. Not yet. The answer came from an unexpected direction. From me. Not because I had solved it. Because I had received something I had not yet processed. A message. Time-stamped earlier that morning. From a deep cover asset embedded within a human research installation. I accessed it. Displayed it. There was very little text. I do not understand what this is, the message read. I have observed its construction for 6 years. I am sending the image now because I believe you need to see it before you act. There was an attachment. An image. The room went quiet again as it resolved. It showed a structure. If it could be called that. It was not a station. Not a ship. Not anything that fit within our classifications. It was a network. A vast arrangement of interconnected nodes, spanning a volume of space too large to process at a glance. The components were linked by frameworks that did not match any known design architecture. Energy readings fluctuated across frequencies that did not correspond to any established category. It was not built to be seen. It was built to function. I heard Admiral Thesk ask a question, though it felt distant. How long? I checked the message again. 6 years observed, I said. Longer in development. He did the calculation. 30 years, he said quietly. I nodded. Yes. Another pause. They started before the treaty was finalized. Yes. While we believed we were integrating them, while we believed they were adapting, they had already begun building something else. The Chancellor did not raise her voice. She did not call for immediate action. Instead, she issued a single order. Convene the Council. The session that followed was, by all measurable standards, controlled. That did not make it calm. Proposals were presented. Strategies outlined. Military responses suggested with increasing urgency. Some argued for immediate deployment. Others for targeted disruption of the structure before it could become operational. Each plan was evaluated. Each plan failed. Not in theory. In the analysis already provided. Every scenario had been anticipated. Every response mapped. Every escalation accounted for. We were not reacting to an unknown threat. We were reacting within a framework that had been prepared for us. The realization settled slowly, but completely. We were not deciding what to do. We were choosing from options they had already calculated. The Chancellor listened to all of it. Then she said something I recorded word for word. They know us better than we know ourselves. No one disagreed. The room fell into a silence that was not uncertainty. It was recognition. After a time, one of the older council members spoke. We could ask them what they want. It was a simple suggestion. Obvious. And yet, in that moment, it was the only one that had not already been accounted for in the analysis. Or at least, the only one that felt like it hadn't. Contact was initiated. Not through secure channels. There was no longer any confidence in what secure meant. An open transmission was sent. A request for communication. The response came in 40 minutes. Not because they needed time. Because they chose it. The screen activated. The face that appeared was not Zaro Hen. It was not any of the individuals who had been present at the beginning. It was the quiet man. Older now. But unmistakable. He looked directly into the channel, as if he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Good afternoon, he said calmly. I imagine you have questions. The Chancellor did not respond immediately. Then she asked the one question that mattered. The structure in the Kepler corridor, she said. What does it do? There was a pause. Measured. And then, for the first time since I had seen him, the man smiled. Not with arrogance. Not with threat. With something far more unsettling. Satisfaction. It's a relay network, he said. Part of a larger system. We call it the backbone. The words settled into the room without context. The Chancellor's voice remained steady. And its function? The man's expression did not change. It ensures continuity, he said. If any centralized system fails, communications, navigation, economic exchange, the backbone maintains operational stability independently. There was a moment where no one spoke. Because the implication did not need to be explained. The sovereignty's control did not rely solely on force. It relied on dependence. Remove the dependence, and control becomes optional. The man continued, almost conversationally. It's not a weapon, he said. We didn't build it to attack you. He paused. We built it so no one would need you. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had not prepared to fight us. They had prepared to make us irrelevant. What followed was not a war. That is important to understand. There were no fleets mobilizing at the edges of contested space. No weapons deployed in desperation. No dramatic declarations broadcast across the galaxy. All of those things had been considered, analyzed, and quietly rendered unnecessary before the moment ever arrived. What followed was a negotiation. An 11-day negotiation that determined the fate of a structure 6,000 years in the making. I attended every session. That is my function. To observe, to record, to ensure that when something changes, there is a record of how and why it happened. I have attended negotiations before. Hundreds of them. They follow patterns, offers and counteroffers, pressure applied and resisted, moments of tension followed by carefully constructed compromise. This did not follow those patterns. Because this was not a negotiation between equals trying to reach balance. This was a negotiation between one side that had already changed the balance, and another that was just beginning to understand that it had shifted. The human representative, Dex Oren, as I would later confirm, was consistent throughout. His tone did not rise. His posture did not change. He did not attempt to dominate the conversation, nor did he retreat from it. He simply remained certain, as though time itself was something he possessed in greater quantity than anyone else in the room. That, more than anything, defined the process. Urgency belongs to those who need something. The humans did not need anything. They had already built what they required. The sovereignty, for the first time in its recorded existence, did. Proposals were made. Objections raised. Specific clauses debated in exhaustive detail. The removal of technological restrictions. The restructuring of governance. The introduction of independent arbitration systems that would operate beyond sovereignty control. Each point was contested. Each point was defended. And each time the discussion circled back to the same underlying reality. The backbone existed. It was operational. And it had already been quietly introduced, in fragments, to a significant number of compact member species. Not formally. Not publicly. But enough. Enough that if the sovereignty attempted to assert control through the systems it had always relied upon, those systems could be bypassed. That was the shift. Not power. Not force. For thousands of years, the compact had functioned because membership was, in practice, dependent. Leave the system and you lost access to trade routes, to communication networks, to navigational frameworks that made interstellar movement viable. Leaving was possible. Surviving outside it was not. The backbone changed that. It did not break the system. It removed the consequence of leaving it. And once that consequence was gone, everything built on it began to loosen. I watched the Sovereignty Council come to this realization in stages. First resistance. Then recalculation. Then, finally, acceptance. Not immediate. Not willing. But inevitable. There was a moment, midway through the negotiations, when Fleet Commander Bessa Rialt, who had argued most strongly for military action, fell silent during a discussion of potential responses. Dex Oren did not address her directly. He did not need to. The analysis had already done that. Every aggressive scenario had been mapped. Every deployment anticipated. Every escalation answered. Not with superior force. With preparation. Bessa reviewed the projections again. Then she sat down. And did not speak for the remainder of that session. That was when I understood something else. The humans had not just studied our systems. They had studied our decisions. Not what we could do. What we would do. The difference is subtle but critical. Capabilities can change. Patterns rarely do. By the 10th day, the shape of the outcome was clear. The sovereignty could reject the terms. It could attempt to maintain control. It could initiate conflict. All of those options still existed. They had simply stopped being effective. The Chancellor understood this. I saw it in the way she approached the final session. There was no hesitation. No visible frustration. Only a kind of measured clarity that I had not seen before. She spoke directly. We are not negotiating the future, she said. We are acknowledging it. Dex Oren inclined his head slightly. Yes, he said. There was no triumph in the response. No satisfaction. Just agreement. The treaty was finalized on the 11th day. It was not called a surrender. It was not framed as a loss. Officially, it was an evolution of the compact structure. A modernization. A transition toward a more balanced and cooperative framework. Those were the words recorded. They were not inaccurate. They were simply incomplete. Because what had actually occurred was simpler than that. Control had become unnecessary. And when something becomes unnecessary, it does not collapse. It fades. The signing ceremony was held in a chamber designed for moments of significance. I had stood in that room many times before, documenting agreements that shaped the direction of entire systems. This one felt different. Not larger. Quieter. More final. Kol Vash was present, now serving as humanity's military liaison within the newly structured council. He watched the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to define. Not satisfaction. Not relief. Something steadier. As though he were observing the completion of a process that had never truly been in doubt. Finn Adler attended as well. Older now. Less formal. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had already stepped away from the weight of what had been built. I watched him speak briefly with Admiral Thesk after the signing. The conversation was quiet, private, but I saw the moment something in Thesk's posture shifted. Later, I asked him what had been said. He told me. Finn had explained that the initial framework for the backbone had been drafted the day the original treaty was presented. The day the 200-year restriction was revealed. Because at that moment, it had become clear that the system, as offered, would never provide what humanity required. So they had decided to build it themselves. All of it. Quietly. Over time. Without interruption. Thesk told me he had not known how to respond to that. Finn apparently had helped. Don't take it personally, he had said. If we were in your position, we would have done the same. Thesk said he was still not certain whether he found that reassuring or deeply unsettling. I understood why. Because it meant this had never been about opposition. It had been about inevitability. After the ceremony, I found myself seated across from Dex Oren. The moment was unplanned. He recognized me before I spoke. You're the witness, he said. I inclined my head. I am. I've read some of your reports, he continued. That surprised me. Which ones? I asked. The early ones, he said. From the treaty period. There was a brief pause. You noted that we knew something you didn't. I remembered writing that. No one acted on it, I said. No, he agreed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been forming since the message arrived. You could have chosen a different approach, I said. Why this one? He considered that. Not carefully. Simply, honestly. We didn't want a war, he said. There was no emphasis. No attempt to persuade. Just a statement. We wanted what the agreement said we were being offered. Equality. Partnership. A place in a system that didn't require us to become dependent on it. He paused. When we realized that wasn't what the system actually provided, we had a choice. He met my gaze. We could complain, he said. Or we could build something better. I thought about that. About the years. The planning. The patience required to pursue a course like that without deviation. That takes time, I said. Yes, he replied. 34 years is a long time to prepare. It is, he agreed. I hesitated, then asked the question that mattered most to me. Were you ever concerned we would notice? For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not doubt. Not uncertainty. Something older. Something that had been there once and had not entirely disappeared. Every day, he said. There was no elaboration. None was needed. I filed my final report on the Treaty of Sovereign Equality 3 days later. It was, by a significant margin, the longest report I have ever written. Longer than my account of the Pell War. Longer than my documentation of the Vorath collapse. Because this was not just an event. It was a transition. The final section of that report contained my personal assessment. It is not standard practice for witnesses to include such things. They are rarely read. But I included it anyway. I wrote that the sovereignty had spent 6,000 years building a system designed to eliminate uncertainty, to anticipate every threat, to control every variable. And in doing so, we had overlooked a single possibility. Not an enemy, not a rival, but a species that did not intend to fight us at all. A species that simply intended to be free. Because defeat requires confrontation. It requires conflict. A moment where one side overcomes the other. This had no such moment. There was no battle. No clear line between before and after. Humanity did not defeat the sovereignty. They studied it, understood it, and then built something that made it unnecessary. They did not break the system. They stepped beyond it. And in doing so, they left the door open for everyone else. I ended the report with a final note. A simple one. The humans smiled when they signed the first treaty. I had recorded it at the time without understanding its significance. I understand it now. It was not a gesture of agreement. It was the expression of